evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This workshop, which is Resilient Landscaping, Gardening in the Defensible Space Zone, is funded by a County of Sonoma Vegetation Management grant. We thank them for their support in bringing this workshop to you this evening. I'd also like to thank Daily Acts for their support in getting the word out and providing outreach about this workshop. My name is John Kanegi. I'm very excited to be with you this evening. I'm a design and implementation project manager with the Sonoma Ecology Center, and this workshop was created specifically for the Petaluma area and the South County community, although the wider community was invited as well, so there may be some folks from outside of those regions. At the Sonoma Ecology Center, our mission is to work with our community to identify and lead actions that achieve and sustain ecological health in Sonoma. And I'm very happy to be the first of 3 panelists that will be speaking. You'll see a larger panel of folks that will also be involved in the discussion and be able to respond to questions and so forth towards the end of the program. And I'll direct your attention before I move on to the subtitle, which is Garden as if Life Depends on It, a quote from Doug Tallamy, who is the author of a number of books. One of them, and the subject where this quote comes from, is called Bringing Nature Home, and it refers to the importance of supporting habitat in our home landscapes because our own lives are so inextricably connected to the natural world around us. So a couple of housekeeping items before we move into the content. This is a webinar, so you do not have audio or video activated. The webinar is being recorded, and we'll share with you within a day or two in an email how you can access that recording so that you can view it again or share it with others. And then please, if you would, questions, we really would like to hear your questions, and we'll respond to them at the end of the program. But we would really like you to put those questions in the Q&A box rather than using chat for that. And then you'll notice, and I've got a picture here, you'll notice a pretty strong preference for growing or gardening with native plants in our landscapes due to their adaptability to our climate and how they provide so much habitat. They're also very beautiful, I'd like to think. This is a scene from my own home landscape here, and I'll point out that the yellow plant in the background is sulfur buckwheat. There's some coast buckwheat that's not in bloom in between here, and then the foreground plant is coyote mint, Monardella villosa. And we'll talk more about plants as we go through this program. The Resilient Landscapes Coalition is a partnership that was formed a few years ago. Our website is there at the bottom, sonomaresilientlandscapes.com. I invite you to check out the resources that are there. The partnership brought together these organizations, Fire Safe Sonoma, Roberta and Marika in particular there. Habitat Corridor Project is a nonprofit created by April Owens, and she'll be our 3rd speaker this evening. Again, I'm from the Sonoma Ecology Center, and another founding member of the Resilient Landscapes Coalition is Ellie Inslee, who's on the panel with us this evening. And the UC Master Gardener program is represented this evening by Mimi Enright, who will be the 2nd speaker. And Jennifer Roberts is helping out with the logistics and has been giving some great presentations on maintenance for the landscape, for the Firewise landscape as well. We also do these programs in partnership with fire agency folks. We vet our content through them. We learn from them, and hopefully they learn some things from us as well. We also have with us on the panel Jessica Power. She's a fire marshal for the city of Petaluma. Welcome, Jessica. And she will be available to help answer questions during our question and answer period, or we're inviting her to stop us if she has something to add or correct or something that we might say. Quick outline for this evening. I will start with some fire context, talk about ecology and sustainability. Next, Mimi, again from Sonoma County Master Gardeners, will provide design and maintenance principles for defensible space. April Owens, Habitat Corridor Project, will follow with some landscape design and planting examples, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and conversation after that. I do find that these webinars make me feel like I'm never sure if I'm the only person in the audience or something. I can assure you, you're not. We're up at around 35 or 40 participants. So don't feel alone. I do realize that the webinars can contribute to a little bit of a disconnect in the audience. Oh, okay, moving on. Then here we see a lovely scene of some native herbaceous perennials called coral bells growing in the shade of an oak canopy, some leaf litter on the ground. The flowers are providing nectar and shelter for insects. The oak tree above, tremendous source of a habitat, hosting lots of insects that are food for birds, acorns, of course. And this is the kind of landscape that we'd like to help you create. So we're talking about creating and tending landscapes that have multiple benefits, not just fire-wise, but also that are contributing beauty, habitat, sustainability in the sense of carbon sequestration, water quality, that sort of thing. We sometimes talk about recovery of a forest after a wildfire, as if fire is always something bad the forest has to recover from. It's good to remember, though, that fire is a natural and a healthy part of many of our ecosystems in California. The loss of a home, the loss of loved ones is understandably very traumatic and produces a lot of concern, a lot of fear. And some folks have responded to those concerns by clearing a lot or most of the vegetation from around their homes, and which can result in problems of erosion, of actually the growth of a lot of weeds that become a fire problem in their own right, and certainly the loss of habitat. We might call this like a moonscape, and you see these where they're pretty much nothing but gravel and some boulders, and if anything, maybe an agave or two. And then there's others that will hesitate to do anything because they're simply unsure what to do. So this workshop is all about helping you create defensible space that is at the same time beautiful and sustainable and biodiverse. So many of us live in this beautiful area because of those, the wonderful, the views and resources. And we understand, and we're understanding better and better that the land is really adapted to fire. The watersheds in this Petaluma area are made up of grasslands and oak woodlands in large part, which were tended by native people who used fire as a tool to improve hunting and acorn harvests, the desirable stands of food and fiber. These plant communities and much of the US West are fire adapted systems, but the combination of historic fire suppression along with climate change and its warmer, drier conditions, and we'll talk about, and also the fact that people are increasingly moving into the edges of wildlands, have brought catastrophic wildfires and the need to be really concerned about defensible space. So while low intensity and frequent fire is part of a forest's natural cycle and is part of a healthy forest ecosystem, catastrophic wildfires, like we often see recently, are very costly. They're traumatic for unprepared landowners, and we have to combine defensible space for our properties around our homes with wildland management that may utilize fire if that's appropriate, but can utilize other management techniques where it simply isn't appropriate to do prescribed fire, for example. So catastrophic wildfire can not only shift species diversity, but it also has a huge environmental impact when structures burn due to the air and the water pollution from released toxins, and the tremendous environmental costs of rebuilding, the need to produce all of that concrete again, metal and plastic, the wood, the materials that go into a new home. So we'll look a little bit at some fire history, with the exception of just a few fires. Most of the wildfires in this period, 1935 to 2014, have been relatively small, typically in the 2,000 to 10,000 acre range or smaller. But recently, in just these 6 years, 2015 to 2020, we've had these massive fires like the Kincaid, like the Wall Bridge, like the glass fires. And there's this very strong connection between human settlement and the wildlands and how that interplays with wildland fires. We'll look here at two maps that are showing the exact same area in 1964 and in 2017. And let me help you get oriented. Let me see if I can switch to a laser pointer here. This area in the 1964 map shows the city of Santa Rosa, showing the level of high density housing development in red. And it goes up the Highway 101 corridor and crosses the Napa County line. So this is the town of Calistoga over here. So we see 40 or so years later, the expansion of that high density urban development, and really a tremendous expansion of this low density development into the wildlands. Now, what's shown in pink are these two fires. In 1964, the Hanley fire, and in 2017, the Tubbs fire. They have a very similar footprint and actually have very similar sort of fire conditions, the weather conditions, the fuel load, that sort of thing. But what is very different is, the change in human settlement with much more movement into this wildland urban interface, or the WUI, we sometimes call it, causing really very much more loss of life and loss of homes in the more recent 2017 Tubbs fire. So some would say that we need to avoid building in the WUI or more building, but we've got what we've got, and so it's our responsibility to not only take care of the land, but also our human neighbors and our wildlife neighbors. Let's have a quick look at fire and fire hazard severity, and also, I was going to say look at risk and fire hazard severity, and also mention some defensible space regulations that we should be aware of. So when you consider risk, they're going to run from a very broad or regional level to a community, and then eventually a very personal level, like what the risk level is for your particular home. This map starts out with that broadest landscape level. This is the CAL FIRE Fire Hazard Severity Zone map for Sonoma County. The colored parts of the map represent the state responsibility area, or SRA. It's often abbreviated. Whereas the white parts are mostly the LRA, or local responsibility area. I say mostly because there's a bit of up here some federal responsibility area, but mostly what you're seeing is LRA shown in white. So in the Petaluma area, down here, we've got mostly a moderate fire level severity zone with some of the high in the hills to the northeast. Sonoma County also has a community wildfire protection plan, or CWPP, that also has some very good risk assessments for the county that you might be interested in looking at. And you can find that pretty easily just by Googling Sonoma County CWPP, and you'll find the work that it's in progress that they're working on around risk and hazard there. Regarding regulations, we've got State Code 4291, which requires 100 feet of defensible space in forest, shrub, and grass-covered lands. It also speaks to a 0 to 5 foot ember-resistant zone, and that element is going to see some revision later this year. And I think Mimi has some new slides and information about that new sort of what we call the zone 0, the 0 to 5 foot zone. Sonoma County Ordinance 13A also requires maintenance of defensible space. And then the city of Petaluma has some defensible space recommendations. It has a weed abatement ordinance for creating defensible space. And maybe Fire Marshal Power can speak to that, and certainly will if folks have questions towards the end of the program. So as we said, or as I said, risk considerations kind of start at a more global level and become, kind of hone down in towards your own home and situation. So you'd want to ask yourself, when you're thinking about risk, what are the vegetation patterns in the broader landscape around the community? That's kind of like the mapping that we were seeing. How do they contribute to potential fuel loads? What are the resources and conditions in your own neighborhood? Are you very much at the edge with difficulty with, or challenges around egress and ingress? Is there a network of fire hydrants in your city streets, or are you beyond, the limits of that infrastructure? Then you want to think about the conditions on your very own property, including the topography. Is a house at the top of the hill or at the bottom of a canyon or slope? Has the house been assessed as far as the structure itself? Have home hardening practices been completed? And if so, what steps should be taken now working out into the landscape? You can have some personal risk perspective on risk, or you will have some personal risk perspective, like how will you balance risk with other factors such as sustainability, aesthetics, and home improvement costs. But you do have to be obviously respectful of code and ordinances. There might be HOA rules as well that you'll have to follow. But to give an example of how one might do an assessment of risk and make some decisions where decisions can be made, Public Resources Code 4291 does say that the amount of fuel modification necessary shall consider the flammability of the structure as affected by building material, building standards, location, and type of vegetation. So what I'm getting at is that if you take certain steps around home hardening, for example, then you might be able to take, be a little bit less strict around certain other elements of the defensible space. Again, always in accordance with the local law. So each individual must assess their own personal risk and tolerance, but your risk decisions do intersect with those of your neighbors. And so, nobody is an island of their own. Okay, let's look at the 3 types of fire exposure to a home during a wildfire event. We'll start with radiant heat, and that's often happens when one home, the heat from a burning house ignites a neighboring house, one particularly close. So the countermeasure here is typically hardening of the home. We don't typically see radiant heat from a wildfire causing a ignition of a home. It's typically more so structure to structure. As they show it here, it's from an outbuilding to the house. There's also the possibility of direct flame contact, shown here in the top right. And that's when a wildfire burns right up to the edge of the property and it keeps on going towards the house. And so educational messages around that have often focused on this type of exposure and how to reduce the direct flame contact by interrupting the path of fire, sort of out here at the landscape's edge. But embers, which is shown in the bottom one, are by far the most common cause of structure fires. And preparing for embers takes a little different approach because they're not coming from the edge. They're just simply raining down on all of the property and accumulating or being concentrated in certain parts of the property. So embers are tiny bits of burning material that can blow in from the fire front, and it can be, a quarter of a mile, half a mile or more away. It causes this spotting where ahead of the fire front, you get new ignitions. They will land, as I say, all over the property, including on the roof and in the landscape. So the majority of structure ignitions are associated with these embers. They can ignite building components and contents directly, or they can ignite vegetation and other combustible items adjacent to or near the building, which can then result in a radiant heat or direct flame contact exposure. So embers have a way of finding the weaknesses in a home. Of particular concern is the presence of dried leaves and other plant material that may accumulate on the roof and in the gutters and inside of landscape plants. Since most building ignitions have been attributed to embers, this is a particularly important aspect to be aware of as we work to prepare our homes and our landscapes against future fires. So you can do this exercise with your own home. Go out, have a look, and imagine embers falling on it. And think of or look at your landscape through the sort of a lens of identifying receptive fuel beds. So think about where an ember would ignite organic materials and transmit the fire to the home. For example, embers may land on and ignite debris that's accumulated in your gutters here, or in the inside corners of the roof line. There's often accumulation of dried leaves and so forth. The burning debris then can cause a direct fire contact on the edge of the roof. Embers, of course, are going to fall not only on the roof, but all over the landscape. So let me drop some embers into the landscape here. And similarly, you want to think about, okay, so where can an ember start a fire here? If it starts, where's it going to go? What are the sources of fuel? Can it move up into the trees vertically? Is it going to move through this ground cover, or is it, is that less likely because it's pretty herbaceous and there's not a lot of dried leaves accumulated in it? You can think about, like, what will this rock wall do? Will that be something of a barrier to move for fire moving from one part of the landscape to another? And in fact, it very likely would, but every situation is going to be a little bit different. So in the next presentation, Mimi and April, will discuss guidelines for defensible space design and maintenance. But before I turn it over to them, let me emphasize another element of the home landscape, and that's the important ecological role that our gardens play. So we have a tremendous opportunity here to reconsider our home landscapes through this lens of fire resiliency. If we're going to make some changes around fire resiliency, then let's also design our gardens so they can play an important role in restoring the ecological system and encouraging sustainability. So maybe we're also going to consider, removal of a lawn, for example, something that captures stormwater that increases wildlife habitat. So humans, of course, human development has destroyed and fragmented much of our wildlands. And we tend to think of like forests, grasslands, chaparral as the home for wildlife. But these wildlands are now so fragmented, so chopped up into small pieces that our home gardens are needed to provide critical habitat. So Doug Tallamy is that entomologist from University of Delaware, I believe, that I mentioned in the opening slide, the author of that book, Bringing Nature Home. And he promotes this idea of making our gardens into habitat oases. He opens that book that I described with this statement: for the first time in history, gardeners have become important players in the management of our nation's wildlife. And I love that. And it excites me about not only gardening, but having a role in education. So our gardens can provide critical ecosystem services, and let's have a closer look at those. Just briefly, some services that our home landscape, that is to say our defensible space, can provide include things like shade, which would reduce our need for air conditioning of the home. They can be very beautiful, and there's many studies that show improved health, improved mental health for people being around plants, being in nature. Plants will enrich soil and hold it in place. A well-designed landscape can clean and manage stormwater. This idea of slow it, spread it, sink it, and store it refers to the rainwater that falls on your property. Rather than trying to collect it and get it out through a drainage system out to the street and down into the nearest creek as fast as possible, very much better is to keep it on your property, allow it to slow it down, spread it out in some sort of a detention basin, a bioswale, a rain garden, allow it to sink in and be stored as groundwater. All plants can contribute to sequestration of carbon, so we can do some things around increasing that on our property. And we want to support birds and other pollinators. That is to say, we want to increase biodiversity. So I love this slide, not only because I think insects are pretty cool and really pretty, but also because so many animals rely on insects, either directly or indirectly, for food. And without insects, it is said that there wouldn't be really much other higher life. They're that important. And obviously, they're one of the most populous organisms on Earth. We've been hearing a lot lately about the significant loss of insect biodiversity. And people talk about as much as 75 or 80% over the last 20 to 30 years. And the Western monarch butterfly is kind of the poster child for that. It's an important example that we've heard a lot about lately. Studies have shown that the loss of habitat is a primary driver for that loss of insect biodiversity, along with pesticide use, with climate change and other things. So it's important that we take steps to protect and create habitat as we manage wildland fuels. Simply put, native plants like these provide better, like these, which again are also from my home landscape. They provide better habitat and resources for native insects. And our insects are a primary food source for our birds, reptiles, amphibians, fish, mammals, the whole gamut. So you might think, well, lavender and rosemary are also really, I see honeybees on them all the time. And that is the case. Honeybees are not a native insect, although they are, very critically important for our food supply. But plants like this that are native blooming plants will not only also keep the European honeybee pretty happy, but also be so much better of a food source for our own native insects. All right, so how do we support biodiversity? April's going to have lots of examples of plant materials and ways of combining them and so forth. But just some general guidelines, we want to choose native plants most of the time. Now, it's okay to have some amount of non-natives, to have a lemon tree, to have a favorite rose bush or some heirloom from grandma or something like that. But native plants, if they can become sort of the dominant feature in our California landscape, would do so much for pollinators and other wildlife. If you want a number, then we talk about 70 to 80% natives might be a goal. We also don't want to just plant them, sort of randomly or widely spaced, but plant islands of them. And this has kind of two benefits. the habitat for wildlife, birds, for example, insects, reptiles, is going to be greater if plants, native plants, are grouped together into these little clusters or islands. And then it also has a defensible space element, a firewise element, in that we will separate these islands then with some, a space that doesn't have plants. So, it could be a pathway or a dry stream feature or a patio or walkway, whatever. And Mimi will talk, in great detail about what some of the options are for dividing up these islands of plants. We also want to minimize pesticide use. And to do so, we apply integrated pest management, looking for other options, resorting to chemical pesticides, if at all, as a very, very last option. And then providing a water source is very important for many, many insects and birds and other wildlife. So another way to support biodiversity is to take very good care of our trees, and oak trees in particular. And I say oaks in particular because in most of the places where they are, certainly in California, most of California, oaks are what are considered a keystone species. That means that they're so closely connected to so many other species that if you remove them from the ecosystem, there'd just be tremendous impacts. Here's a photo on the left of an oak woodland with an understory of the same plant that was shown earlier, coral bells, which is a drought-tolerant plant, would require very little, if any, irrigation. So it's not going, they're going to coexist very well. We also see, a nice ground covering of leaf litter that's going to be very beneficial. Wouldn't be appropriate, very near the house, but moving out a little farther, that would be a perfect thing to cover for covering the ground. So oak trees are incredibly productive food factories for wildlife. We think first of the acorns, and indeed there's over 100 vertebrate species that depend on acorns, including squirrels and deer and many birds. But what we don't tend to think so much about is the huge number of insects that use oaks as a food source. And we don't need to be concerned and have our trees sprayed and things like that. In most cases, the oak is perfectly happy to support these, and all of these caterpillars, weevils, beetles, they're on their leaves, they're in the crevices of the bark, they're down in the root system. All of this is great food for many of our favorite garden birds, such as quail and bluebirds, robins, orioles, acorn woodpeckers, as well as lizards and other wildlife. Even these birds that we think of as being seed eaters predominantly, when they are feeding their nestlings, they're largely looking for insects as a food source. So we want to keep these oak trees healthy for the habitat they provide, but also because a declining or a dying tree can be very fire prone, and that would be, of course, true of any plant. It's also important to protect the root system, including minimizing any irrigation that, in the case of an oak, would be generally unwanted in the summertime, as they are adapted to a summer dry climate. We want to avoid compaction or digging within the drip line, or even beyond the drip line, the edge of the canopy, if it's possible. And I mentioned leaf litter before, again, where that's appropriate. It's great because it feeds the soil microorganisms, supports the tree's overall health. Another thing that we can do to enhance biodiversity is to take care to prevent the invasion of exotic weedy plants. In the larger photo, this is two photos here overlaid. On this right side, you see the results of some sort of vegetation management that left a lot of bare soil. So not only is it prone to erosion with rains, but also leaves sort of a vacuum. There's no wildlife habitat here, and it leaves a vacuum that can be invaded by invasive plants. This is a different photograph, but shows an area that has had that invasion by, in this case, Scotch broom, which also provides very little habitat and will just not let up, producing thousands of seeds per plant that last for a very long time in the soil. So take care to, that would often be sort of a first priority. Vegetation management action would be to remove invasive plants. And they're often very fire prone as well, the Scotch broom. Now, you'll be hearing some recommendations for spacing of plants and plant groupings. And so this may require some amount of plant removal or some extensive pruning. So the timing of that vegetation management becomes very important. Birds are nesting from March through August, and so the best time for extensive plant removal is going to be from September to February. I'll touch on a few more defensible space ecosystem services. Plants and landscapes also enrich soil and hold it in place. We see some native ground covers here, protecting a slope from soil erosion, which is going to have positive benefits on water quality further down in the watershed. And plants are also a defense against climate change in that they sequester atmospheric carbon, and landscapes encourage stormwater to infiltrate on our properties, protecting water quality and recharging the groundwater. Spend a little bit more time on carbon sequestration. All plants will do this. Big plants will do it more than small plants. So trees are particularly important in carbon sequestration. Plants photosynthesize by drawing carbon dioxide from the air along with water and nutrients from the soil. And they do that. And in doing so, they take that carbon from the carbon dioxide, and that's how they grow. That's how that goes into the carbohydrates and the proteins and so forth in their cells. That is both above ground and below ground. That carbon is bound up in the plant and eventually often makes its way to the soil as leaves fall, as roots grow and then die and slough off cells and regrow and so forth. That carbon goes down into the soil where it is often stabilized by soil microorganisms. So soils are capable of holding tremendous amounts of carbon, more in fact than the atmosphere can, more in fact than all of the above ground plant parts and animal life combined. So really it's an underutilized resource, and we should think about, certainly we agriculturalists are more and more thinking about keeping carbon in their soils by changing some of their practices around tillage and so forth. But gardeners, we should be thinking about this too, not only protecting our trees, considering planting more trees, but in minimizing soil disturbance, composting, things like that to help keep carbon in the ground, in the soil. So that carbon sequestration and plant growth requires good soil, well-nurtured soil. Soil is a complex network that includes the plant roots, it includes insects, fungi, organic matter, and you get this very intricately connected network of materials and organisms. To help nurture soil, we want to retain and incorporate organic matter. We want to keep the soil covered with plants, with mulch and leaf litter where that's appropriate. Now we'll find that, of course, that's not appropriate near the house, and we'll talk about some guidelines about that here shortly. Also want to avoid synthetic fertilizers, which along with excessive cultivation tend to burn up the organic matter in soil. And coming here, close to the end of the presentation here, just a few words about water. Again, we want to try to have our landscape clean and manage water, keeping water on the property, slowing it down, spreading it out in this way, where designed by April Owens, has a rain garden that's nicely landscaped around the edges. It holds water just during rain events and very shortly after, and that water then percolates into the soil and helps restore groundwater. This also is a great fire break to break up the continuity of vegetation in the landscape. There are some other things that we can do around keeping water on our property, like a laundry to landscape project that takes that gray water, rinse water from the laundry and allows it to go out into the landscape. There's great resources around this in particular, and rainwater storage, which you see down here at the Daily Acts website. So you might want to check that out. All right, with that, I will turn it over to Mimi Enright while you digest this inspirational message here. Mimi is, again, program manager for the UC Master Gardener program of Sonoma County, and she will be talking about design and maintenance principles for defensible space. And thank you so very much.
Thank you, John. Fantastic as always.
Thank you.
Bear with me, y'all, as I work through some screen sharing logistics here. Get myself set up for presentation tonight. So welcome everybody. So wonderful to see so many folks joining us tonight for our workshop. Hopefully many of you are already familiar with who the Master Gardeners are and what we do. We are trained agents of the University of California, and our mission is to extend the educational outreach of UC to our community. We do that with a specific focus on sustainable landscape principles as our core message. And John just did a really beautiful job stepping you all through what those principles are about. And why is that important? John, I think, really eloquently shared our climate is changing, and so are our landscapes, and we know that each property can and should make a difference if they can, especially in regards to supporting biodiversity, but also fire preparedness. So I'm going to be sharing some basic information with you about defensible space with a focus on design and maintenance opportunities that you have to create a more fire-wise and sustainable landscape moving forward. And hopefully this helps give you a framework for assessing your own landscape with a fire-wise lens. The picture on this slide is in the hills above my home, northeast of Cloverdale, in the old Preston community. It used to be a faith healing community in the late 1800s. There's some pretty cool history there. I live in a very high fire severity zone on a slope directly abutting wild and urban interface. So this means that my risk factor, as John discussed, is very high. So as he really eloquently lined out, each of us needs to be assessing our own risk as we plan our actions to increase our safety during a wildfire. But I can assure you that I am paying attention to all the principles we're espousing here tonight. And in fact, I've been tracking a wildfire that started about an hour ago, just east of me on Pine Mountain up in the hills above me, that firefighters are diligently working on getting under control. So it's really important, as we all know, to be incredibly focused on this topic. So we have a lot of territory to cover in a very short amount of time. I'll do a really quick touch on some basic principles, then discuss how to design your home landscape with fire in mind based on the different zones in the 0 to 100 foot zone around your home or structures on your property, what's called the defensible space zone. A quick review of mulch and ongoing maintenance, which is one of the most important aspects of continuing to keep our properties as ready as we can before the next fire. So let's dive right on in. So here's the bottom line. What you do to prepare your home and landscape for the next fire matters. We know what the truths are in this slide. Your actions to prepare for the next wildfire really are key. We all know how hard our firefighters have worked to protect our homes and communities. And given the scope of the wildfires we have seen, we know that we can't assume that there will be a shiny red truck parked outside of your home when the fire comes. So attending this workshop is a really great first step, but coming to this isn't enough. We need to all be taking action, even little steps. We really hope you take at least a few tips away from this meeting and get started so we're all a little better prepared and our homes, family, community, and firefighters are perhaps a little more safe. Okay, so John did a really great job talking about the three threats of fire exposure. But I wanted to cover this basic around fire and fuel, which is really important to the context of our conversation today. So very basically, fire must have three elements in order to burn, and that's fuel, oxygen, and heat. And fire behavior is a function of fuel, weather, and topography. So what's the element that we can control in this equation? It's the fuel. And fuel at a very basic level is anything that will burn. That can be vegetation or landscape mulch, all from a landscape lens, of course, which is what we're discussing here tonight with you. Fencing, roofing, decks, lawn furniture, garbage cans, wood piles, arbors, wooden planter boxes, all of those elements are potential fuel in a fire. So John touched briefly on some new legislation that the state of California is developing on mandating Zone 0. I believe it applies to very high fire severity zones in the SRA, the state responsibility. I do believe there's some LRA in there as well. Got this slide. This is a brand new content. I've not presented this before tonight. Excited to be sharing it with you tonight from a work group, including some UC Cooperative Extension advisors who are working on outlining what the requirements should be for that state legislation with our state fire officials. So John talked about these three different types of fire threat to structures. And defensible space strategies have historically focused on how to reduce that direct flame contact. But preparing for embers and radiant heat exposures takes a different approach. So we're really seeing an evolution of defensible space recommendations with a focus on a relatively newer zone called Zone 0, as well as the critical importance of home hardening. When we first started coming together as a group, as a coalition to do educational outreach on this topic, we couldn't find any graphics that showed Zone 0, which is the 0 to 5 foot perimeter around a home. But it's really important to understand what approaches work against these three types of fire threats, and what we can do to reduce our exposures, and whether that includes, if it's ember defense, creating Zone 0 and doing home hardening, or whether it's breaking up the flow of fire to reduce or minimize the impact of direct flame impact. These are all really important steps that we all need to be taking. Okay, so here are our basic FireWise landscaping principles. And as John talked about, resilient landscape design is really about plant selection and placement, overall garden design with hardscape elements in consideration, and maintenance. And then, of course, we hope that's all done with a lens of sustainability about retaining water on your property, conserving water and energy, supporting wildlife, and sequestering carbon. So I will say there is not scientific research to support all of our recommendations in our presentation tonight, but I will point out through the presentation where recommendations are supported by scientific research. And as we go through today's presentation, you'll see some items highlighted in red, and those represent Sonoma County code requirements. Okay, let's start with some key basic foundational recommendations to make your landscape more FireWise. You want to be removing all dead or dying plants and branches and remove ladder fuels. We are going to be suggesting that you create islands or groupings of plantings with non-combustible paths between them to interrupt the path of fire. You want to avoid planting or mulching close to structures, and I'll go into that in some more detail in our Zone 0 content. And then we'll spend quite a bit of time on what's called ladder fuels. You want to make sure you're pruning up tree limbs at least 6 feet from the ground, or 1/3 of the height of a tree if it's a smaller tree. It's incredibly important to make sure that you don't have anything that directly connects to your home that's organic that could transmit fire to your structures. So that could include wooden gates or wooden fencing that directly attaches to your home, but it also could be a hedge. If you have a hedge that directly attaches to your home, or even wooden edging around plant beds that abuts your home. You want to look at alternatives for anything that you have directly connecting to the home that's not organic, such in this case, metal gate or fence. These are examples on the lower left. It shows a picture from Coffee Park in the Tubbs fire, where there's a fire that's been directly transmitted to the home along a fence, a wooden fence line. And another picture on the right that shows a metal structure that's broken up that wooden fence, and you can see where the fire has stopped and is not transmitted forward to the home. So a really important aspect to consider. So hopefully you are all familiar with the concept of ladder fuels. The goal is to reduce the possibility of having fire move from the ground plane up into the crown of trees. You really want to avoid planting shrubs under trees. But if you do, you want to make sure that you allow at least 3 times the height of the shrub between it and the lowest tree limb. So if you've got a 2-foot shrub, that means you want 6 feet from the top of that shrub to the lowest tree limb. Again, you want to be limbing up all your trees at least 6 feet from the ground, or 1/3 of the height of the tree. And then it's critical to continue to maintain that as it grows. So we're not one and done, but we've got to be focusing on our FireWise maintenance requirements every year as we move forward. So how can you apply a FireWise lens to plant selection? Many of you may have come to this workshop hoping for a fire-resistant plant list. The reality is that all plants can burn, and it's much more important to consider where you place a plant in your landscape and then how you maintain it. So you want to choose plants that will grow to a size appropriate for their location. So when you pick up that little 4-inch pot with a plant at the nursery, you really need to pay attention to what its mature size is going to be and where you're planning to put it in your landscape that will accommodate that size and doesn't create any fire threat. And of course, you want to locate plants where you're not having to do excess pruning to maintain desired spacing. You need to think about, are you putting the plant somewhere where it will thrive? If it's a plant that prefers shade, are you putting it in full sun? A stressed plant is certainly more flammable. Are you up for the maintenance that that plant will require? And what's your appetite for ongoing maintenance in your landscape? Is it invasive? John showed a great slide of Scotch broom, which is highly invasive in Sonoma County. And will it spread to a neighbor's property and create a possible fire threat? And how will that plant change over its lifespan? And lavender, for example, is a really great example. It's a really commonly used plant here in wine country. It starts out as herbaceous and becomes much more woody over its lifespan. So really, after being really deeply enmeshed in this topic, I've started to see a landscape through a different lens. And I think about how fire will move through the landscape around my home and how much fuel that would add to a fire. How much woody mass is there in my home landscape? So with that lens, last winter, I cut back some larger salvias that had become really very woody. And they grew back beautifully in the spring with more herbaceous stems with less woody mass. They'll become woody again in a year or two, and I will cut them back again. But if you don't want to do that kind of regular maintenance, then plant selection for how a plant will change over time is an important consideration as well. Here's some work that our colleague Ellie did at her property to remove some ladder fuels, in this case, managing an older juniper shrub below a tree. On the lower left shows the cleanup work she did to the interior of the juniper shrub to clean out old dead branches and debris. I think juniper has the bad reputation it does, because it does really tend to accumulate a lot of dead debris and materials on its interior. You can see on the right how Ellie has pulled it back away from the tree, and she assures us that it does have the right distance. It's kind of a little optical illusion with the picture of the height of the shrub, with 3 times the height of the shrub from the lowest tree limb. And this is work that we all need to be focusing on and paying attention to as we move forward in our maintaining our home landscapes. So there are specific areas where it's recommended you do not plant. And we'll go into the 0 to 5 foot zone, the zone 0 around the house or structure perimeters in a few minutes. It's also recommended that you don't plant under vents and eaves, in front of windows or combustible siding, under or near decks, and on inside corners of those homes. You can, the embers that John talked about can tend to create an eddy and a whirl on those inside corners, and it's a higher threat. Okay, so let's dive into the zones that make up the 0 to 100 foot defensible space around your home and structures. So your starting point is your house, and we're not going into the topic of home hardening today, as our focus is on the landscape, but it is absolutely the place where you should first be starting on your work. And there are a lot of really wonderful resources to help guide you through the home hardening process. This graphic depicts the different defensible space zones in your home landscape that we're going to be discussing today. So after you've gone ahead and hardened your home, you want to move out to your 0 to 5 foot zone around your structures, then to 5 to 30, and then finally out to 30 to 100 foot. Okay, so the first zone we're going to discuss is zone 0, also called the Ember Defense Zone. As I mentioned earlier, this is a relatively newer zone introduced into the defensible space recommendations. I want to stress that this zone is supported by scientific research. Zone 0 reduces the likelihood of structure ignition by reducing the potential for direct ignition of the structure from flame contact by embers that accumulate at the base of a wall, and or indirect ignitions when embers ignite vegetation, vegetative debris, or other combustible materials located close to the structure that then result in either a radiant heat and or direct flame contact exposure to the structure. This zone is, of course, closest to the house, so it requires our most careful selection and management of vegetation and other possible fuels. Classically, we have massed shrubs against the house called foundation shrubs. So this is a really big shift away from how we have traditionally designed our landscapes. But we really need to think about the fuel that this generates for fire in immediate proximity to our house and structures. Optimally, there are no combustible materials in this zone. At a minimum, you want to remove or minimize planting in vulnerable places where fire could enter your home, under those vents and eaves that we just talked about, in front of windows or combustible siding, and under or near decks. And as we discussed, no fences or wood gates attached to the house, as they can directly move fire to your home. And that also applies to hedges. During a wildfire, as John talked about, thousands of embers can rain down on roofs and pelt the side of homes like hail during a storm. And embers coming into contact with flammable material is the major reason why homes are destroyed during wildfire. You see this picture on the right in the Mark West community in Sonoma County, and a neighbor who's not carrying their load on doing cleaning up their roofs from leafy debris. So we aren't suggesting that you have to remove trees if they're in that 0 to 5 foot zone. Trees provide really important shade during the summer to reduce energy needs inside your home. And John also talked about the really important ecosystem services that many of them provide. But the most important aspect to consider with trees closer to your home is what debris they might drop on the roof or in that 0 to 5 foot zone that you need to maintain. It can make your maintenance easier if you remove limbs within 6 feet of your roof. And you also want to be focusing on regularly removing any dead or dry plant material in zone 0. And certainly during a red flag warning day, if you have to evacuate from your house due to a fire, you want to clean up any debris in this zone around your structures, and if possible, if you have time, on your roof. For example, I have an oak tree that's within 10 feet of my home that drops twigs, acorns, and leaves nearly year round. So I am out on any red flag warning day to clean up any debris. It is something I'm paying attention to throughout fire season. And it is also, I want to highlight, you note that this last bullet's in red. It is a county code requirement to cut any tree limbs within 10 feet of a stovepipe or chimney outlet. And you do need to maintain that on a year-round basis. Okay, let's move on to zone 1, or the 5 to 30 foot zone, also commonly referred to as the home defense zone. I want to stress that this is likely where firefighters will make a stand if they are working to defend your home from a wildfire. So you want to keep this in mind to ensure that they have ease of access. So zone 1, the intent of zone 1 is to reduce the likelihood of fire burning directly to the structure. And that's accomplished by modifying fuels that limits pathways for fire to burn to the structure and reduces the potential for near to building ember generation and radiant heat exposures. So the recommendation for this zone is to plant in islands or groupings of plants that are separated by pathways. In a higher risk zone, you might want to consider making those pathways non-combustible. I want to reiterate that the goal is to interrupt the flow of fire to your home. Optimally, plantings in this zone should be herbaceous or not woody and 3 feet in height or less. You can consider inclusion of an individual or what's often called specimen shrubs or trees, but optimally it would just be a single specimen rather than masses in this zone. And you want to ensure that all plants are accessible for regular maintenance, as you want to keep all plants clear of dead plant material. And this is a great zone, of course, for hardscape such as patios. So the basics in zone 1 from a design lens are low growing, mostly perennial plants. They're well maintained. Consider inclusion of hardscape to break up the planted areas. This picture depicts a Santa Rosa home with a dry creek bed. That's a great use of hardscape for not only retaining water on the property, but also creating separation of those plant groupings in this zone. In zone 2, the 30 to 100 foot zone, called the reduced fuel zone, the actions are really about reducing the potential behavior of an oncoming fire in such a way as to drop the approaching fire from the crown to the ground. So we have the same basic principles as the 5 to 30 foot zone, but you can include shrubs and trees in widely spaced groups. You want to continue to focus on creating islands of vegetation, ensuring that you have easy access for maintenance. Wider pathways can help facilitate that maintenance access. Continue your vigilance, of course, on ladder fuel removal and regularly removing any dead plant material. And it is a county code requirement. There's another one in red to mow any annual grasses to 4 inches in height during fire season. And you want to move any wood piles to this zone with nothing combustible located near that pile within 10 feet in all directions. There are CAL FIRE recommendations For plant spacing guidelines within 100 feet of your home, I want to stress, though, that these are not mandated by law or supported by scientific research. Of course, they're based on our firefighters' experience working in the field. These guidelines are due to flame height and are based on the slope of the land around the home, which is a major consideration in assessing wildfire risk. A fire that will burn, of course, faster and more intensely uphill than along flat ground. And a steeper slope will result in faster moving fire with longer flame lengths. This graphic is depicting shrub spacing. We have talked to fire officials, and they do say that low growing, well irrigated grasses or ground covers or perennials are considered to be acceptable between these plant groupings. Again, each of us needs to assess the overall risk with degree of slope and fire risk to make appropriate decisions in our own home landscapes. This graphic is depicting suggested horizontal tree spacing as well as vertical separation, those ladder fields that we discussed earlier. Note again that 3 times the height of the shrub from the top of the shrub to the lowest tree branches. Horizontal spacing on less than a 20% slope of 10 feet is recommended, and our steeper slopes, that recommended distance is increased. As John referenced early on, we don't have to denude our landscapes in this 100-foot perimeter around the home, but we certainly do want to ensure we have some spacing to reduce the fuel volume and help break up the flow of fire to the house. Here's a great East Bay mud graphic that shows before and after maintenance for an existing mature landscape. It's easy to think of this in terms of a brand new landscape you're installing, but most of us are dealing with existing mature landscapes. In the before picture, we see no break in the planted areas and shrubs massed against the house. And after maintenance, we see islands of vegetation, shrubs next to the house removed, trees limbed up and ladder fields removed, and shrubs and trees have been thinned. You also want to ensure that you and your family and firefighters have clear access in and out of your property. What would you do to make this driveway more fire-wise? You can follow the same vegetation management principles we talked about in Zone 2. You certainly want to mow those grasses or weeds to 4 inches in height, limb up those trees. You need to be maintaining vegetation on both sides of the roads or driveway, 10 feet from the road edge and 15 feet vertically. And it's recommended to maintain 12 feet of unobstructed pavement for the passage of vehicles. So once you've done the work to harden your home and prepare your defensible space, it's important to reach out to and work with your neighbors, work together to develop a fuel reduction plan, watch for maintenance that's needed, and consider the total volume of vegetation in the area. And if you reside in a more densely forested area, you can control fire behavior by reducing ladder fuels, opening up the canopy, and maintaining ground fuels. This will help the firefighters with fire suppression during a fire. But again, because new vegetation will regenerate in these areas, reentry into the stand is necessary every few years. This is actually the shaded field break. This picture is a depiction taken directly behind my house. This is actually within my 30 to 100 foot zone. Again, in the context of our very high fire severity zone, directly adjacent to the wild and urban interface. Very important that we and our neighbors have been doing this important work in our fire preparedness. This is actually a shot from my 0 to 5 foot zone of my house, looking across to my neighbor's property. My neighbor's property is within 30 feet of my home, within my 100-foot defensible space zone. I'm not sure you can really see it clearly, but that's my neighbor from that shaded field break work up the hill has actually got piles of branches of brush waiting to be chipped by our free chipping program through County of Sonoma. Again, in our small neighborhood, many of us are working really hard on our defensible space, especially in the context of our very high fire severity risk. It is an ongoing process with all the maintenance needed every year, and incremental improvements to make our homes and neighborhood are happening every year. Throughout the year, you need to continuously monitor for this needed maintenance. It is a county code requirement to regularly remove any dead plants and branches from trees and shrubs. Excuse me, and it's recommended to remove vines from trees and shrubs as well. Here are maintenance recommendations annually before fire season. You want to do pruning and any vegetation thinning if possible in fall and early winter to avoid harm to bird breeding. As John referenced earlier, you don't want to cut grass to bare dirt. It's important to keep viable vegetation in place for erosion control. Be particularly sensitive about dry leaf litter at the beginning of fire season. We should probably start paying attention to that as early as May or June. Great opportunity over the winter and early spring to cut back any woody perennials and shrubs as needed. Want to thin any overgrown vegetation. Again, considering timing of plant removals based on wildlife cycles. And then again, when we move into fire season, you want to move any wood piles you brought in close to the home during the winter to 30 feet, with at least 30 feet from a building, and cover them with a fire resistant tarp and or clear surrounding vegetation. Every few years as needed, you want to thin and reduce tree canopies to remove twig growth and maintain your separation and reduce your overall fuel load. Again, keep the lowest branches of trees pruned up at least 6 feet from the ground, and continue to cut back any ground covers and vines and remove any buildup of dry stems and dead leaves. Okay, let's touch quickly on mulch. Mulch is a really important aspect of sustainable landscaping. It helps with weed suppression and water conservation. Wood mulches are organic and as such combustible materials which can transmit fire. So it's recommended not to use mulch in a widespread or continuous manner. The recommendation is to choose larger size wood chips. The picture on the left shows some composted wood chips, actually from the property I live on. On the right, that's gorilla hair mulch. No gorilla hair. That's a picture from Fire Safe Marin, and it shows you how embers that landed in that gorilla hair can tend to smolder. The risk is that firefighters, if they've come to defend your home, may move on to defend another property, and those embers in that gorilla hair mulch, which is highly flammable, could flare up and spread fire to the home. Composted wood chips have demonstrated the least hazardous fire behavior overall of 8 mulch treatments that were tested in the study by the University of Nevada at Reno and the University of California. It's my understanding that there's a new mulch study that's underway, which I'm really excited to see what the results of that are going to be, hopefully with more combustibility studies on other mulch materials than they studied in that one. In higher fire risk areas, you want to consider separating mulched areas possibly with non-combustible and ignition resistant materials such as concrete, gravel, rock, and or perhaps a native grass lawn in your 5 to 30 foot zone. Here's some great examples of ideas. Again, a dry creek bed or a gravel pathway separating some mulched areas. The recommendation is to use 2 to 3 inches of mulch in those islands of plantings where you've got them. And again, the scientifically supported recommendation is for no organic mulch in the 0 to 5 foot zone, and particularly important for higher fire risk areas. So here's a quick recap of on the Firewise design considerations in the defensible space zone. In your 0 to 5 foot zone from your home, you want to use no organic materials if possible. Use inorganic materials such as gravel or stepping stones. In the 5 to 30 foot zone from the house, you want to plant in islands with materials such as low herbaceous perennials, grasses or succulents, and specimen or individual shrub or tree are optimal. And then in the 30 to 100 foot zone from the house, same basic principles as 5 to 30, but you can use those tree and shrub groupings in widely spaced groups, separated by areas that break up the flow of wildfire. Again, ongoing maintenance is essential for a Firewise landscape, particularly with the drought. You will want to be monitoring trees and shrubs closely and removing dead or dying branches. You want to prune out any dead material that can build up from the interior of shrubs whenever possible. You want to, of course, continue your vigilance on ladder fuels. And certainly, if you are prioritizing removal of any plants due to the drought and water conservation measures, you might want to consider removal of any shrubs under trees to remove any possible ladder fuels. So hopefully this has helped give you a framework for assessing your landscape and making it more Firewise. For more information, we have many resources on our website, our Master Gardener website, to help you on both waterwise and Firewise gardening and much, much, much more. There's a link to our webpage, which I'm sure Jen will put in the chat for us. And of course, you are always welcome to send your questions into our Master Gardener information desk via the email listed there. So with that, hold on, let me get back in some logistics. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, April Owens from Habitat Corridor Project. And April, hold on, I'm trying to get my stop share. There we go. Stop share. Hopefully you're good to go now, April.
Thank you, Mimi and John. Those were amazing presentations. So I just get to wrap it up. And then we get questions at the end. So I am going to share my screen. And you all need a minute, just go take a break and wiggle around because I know this is a long presentation. So if I have it in, okay, how's this looking will John or Mimi or somebody tell me if you can
Looks
see?
perfect.
Okay, great. So deep breath. There was a lot of information, like you are ready. And so I'm going to give you all some tips on how to do this. Like, how do I create the 0 to 5 and what are the plants that go in there? So I'm excited to be with you. Let's see. My name is April Owens, and I am the co-creator of the Habitat Corridor Project with Nancy Bauer, who wrote a book around habitat landscape gardening. I also am an avid CNPS, Native Plant Society member, which I highly recommend to you all. And I own April Owens Design LLC, which is a B Corp that funds the Corridor Project. So 10% of our profits go into the Habitat Corridor Project. So it's a little confusing sometimes to folks. Just reach out to us and we can figure it out how to help you with your landscape. But the Habitat Corridor Project started after my Green MBA at Dominican University. And we are here to create and promote California native plant restoration gardens in the urban environment. So we want to create them. We want to have demonstration gardens. And we are here to, it was lovely to join this Resilient Landscape Coalition. When Ellie Inslee reached out to me, it was so exciting to start stretching our bandwidth and teaching these classes. So as John talked about, resilient landscapes, and he gave the definition of resilient, but the way we approach and our whole group approaches designing is the system thinking, like really thinking about landscapes that are not just like every year, like every 4 years, we're just looking at drought, or every 5 years, we're looking at fire. Like we need to think about California as this consistent, beautiful place that has these problems and these issues and these questions to be solved of drought, fire, development, and biodiversity. So we're trying to help you guys think about all these pieces in your designs and your landscapes. And so I wanted to talk for a minute about designing in sustainability. So when you look at your whole landscape, and we'll dive into some details, but you're like backing up and looking at the broader picture. And I know you're not landscape designers or landscape architects, but you can think about your garden how will you keep water on site? Where are the permeable surfaces? What are local materials that you can use to not strip the environment? And how are you going to incorporate water-wise hydration of plants and think about plant community in your landscape? So this is just like when you're starting out on this journey, it's a nice way to start thinking about all the things about sustainability, because I know that's just a term that we throw at you, but it's really about resilience and thinking about your landscape in a different way. So I'm going to riff off of John and Mimi, but I want to just show you some really easy ways and some of my tools that I use in the 0 to 5 since we've been creating these gardens. Really, the Habitat Corridor Project just started doing these Firewise gardens since our first Resilient Landscape Coalition meeting up in the Bennett Ridge community right before COVID. So we literally had one in person and then COVID happened. And so we've been doing these Zoom meetings, which are not as inspiring for sure. And as John said, like you're here, we're all together. Put your comments and your questions in the chat, your questions in the Q&A, but your comments in the chat, and we are here together, but it feels a little challenging in this space. So here, I'm just going to go through some wonderful ways to like think about your 0 to 5. So this is steel edging and some bluestone pavers and Sierra tan pebbles. So you're going to get all these slides. So you'll have these resources to create these landscapes. This landscape isn't shown in the context of the greater environment, but there is also a parking port. So thinking about your landscape, like where are we going to park? What's the 0 to 5 and all that works really well. Here's a really recent one we just completed, where we did the 0 to 5 with these wonderful like mixture of cobbles, and then a nice little island of low high moisture plants that are not a great ignition factor. So Dudleyias and penstemon. So you get a little bit of like, maybe this is probably like 5 by 5. And we actually ended up putting on top of this landscape, we added some compost that is less fire ignition and less fire ignition products. So we put down the mulch that was already on site, and we added compost on top to just make it a little more safe. Another option in the 0 to 5 is to think about, again, with your driveway and like how you can use that, but this is just drain rock, which is a very inexpensive material, and Trinity pebble with a little bit of plant material. You just have to, like John said, and Mimi also talked about the risk factor. If you are in a high fire zone, you want to make sure these plants, if any plants that you plant in this 0 to 5 are super well maintained, and maybe you don't even have plants, but this is a nice option. Then we use this wonderful downspout fountain to bring in the water from the roof and incorporate it into the landscape, and that this drains into a swale out in the broader landscape. You can also see in the background that their patio is right up against the home. So you're building in your patios, your living space around your home versus out in the landscape. Again, this is another one up at Bennett Ridge, and a very high, this was a burned landscape. This is a new build. So I just wanted to show y'all like how you have like opportunity to bring in flagstone, bring in some planting islands and some well-maintained islands of plants up in the landscape. So you're seeing in the 0 to 5 with pebble, but then in the 5 to 30, you have a little bit of island of well-hydrated, easily maintained plants. These are heuchera and a few penstemon and epilobium that can be cut back every year, so that little island is really not a fire worry. Another cobble mix with site boulders. So it's just like seeing you don't have to have just gravel along your 0 to 5. There's a lot of fun options. Here's one out in Occidental to West County, because I know we're speaking to Petaluma and you all like have maybe out in West County. This one, the original is on the right, and then we just made an edit on the left where we added pebble right along the house once we got in on this, on this Resilient Landscape Coalition. So we had this. The original on the right was planted before I joined the Resilient Landscape Coalition. All we had to do was move the mulch out and bring in pebble along the swale that is tied into downspouts and also flows away from the home. It's a very important piece. There's a couple of plants that, you can sneak in a little bit with a really good hardscape. So here is some Dudleya mixed in with a stone staircase tucked in, and then a Diamondia, which is not a native, but a well-behaved ground cover that is surrounded by a lot of flagstone. So that's 0 to 5, which is tricky. And there's a lot of, like I said, a lot of creative ways you can do that. In the 5 to 30, you have a lot more freedom to bring in a low water use, well-maintained plant material, and even some non-natives. Like this client really loves lavender. So you'll see in this bottom left corner that they have these well-tended lavender and this native turf option. I just wanted to let you all know that it's really important to think about this turf really does need a high water expenditure when you install it. So we've been putting it in and testing it out, but it in the long term, it doesn't need a lot of water, but in the short term, it really does need a lot of water. So you just need to think about how much water you want to invest in this beautiful turf, which is a native bent grass mix. But again, you can see in this 0 to 5, 5 to 30, we've used these beautiful concrete pavers with crushed trinity in between them. So we're incorporating that 0 to 5 out to the landscape with this wonderful patio. In the 5 to 30, it's really important to think about what your plant community is. And I know John touched on this, and it deserves some more research. So Jen will throw some Calflora and some other options into the chat. But considering what your plant community is, like this is a coastal plant community that's very well, like easily hydrated, but it tends to be coastal fog oriented. So it gets a lot more water from the coast versus maybe Petaluma. I'm just trying to think of Petaluma, like you have the western orientation, but then you have like the east, which is like going to be a more like grassland situation. But this is a great plant community to do some islands in your 5 to 30. This is Dudleya, this chalk Dudleya, the beautiful native iris and juncus, just a wonderful plant community. But you want to separate them with some hardscape, with some pebble, with some dry creeks and rain gardens. This is a rain garden we created from the downspouts out in the landscape. And so you can see the piping coming down from the downspouts going out to this rain garden that sinks down. And then the photo on the right is what it looks like after. And then we use these gabion walls filled with local rock to hold up the landscape. There are also some fun things you can do. I have a client, I didn't design this, they just did this. This is a low water use fescue with some nice pavers in between with steel edging. Here is decomposed granite, which I know everybody loves. I encourage you to keep it away from your home because it can track in, but this has a binder in it. So it creates this lovely, nice wide pathway through the garden. Back in the 5 to 30 here, I'm thinking Petaluma. This was a site that had really heavy adobe soils and a lot of drainage issues. So we raised this whole pathway up and with crushed with base rock. So it was almost 4 inches higher than the rest of the garden with a swale running through it. And then we used flagstone and crushed rock to create the pathway in between these lush islands of habitat plants like buckwheat and monkey flower and salvias, which are just give you this amazing pop for your landscape. This is out in Occidental, another opportunity. This is a low board formed concrete wall with McMinn manzanita above it, which is a local to West County manzanita, and we just use pebble under it. And manzanitas encourage you to use rock mulch. And a lot of plants don't love that, but it's a really great opportunity here to create this safer. And as these get bigger, we'll clean them up and show off the lovely bark and keep encouraging this pebble underneath. Some inexpensive pathway ideas. So I just wanted to throw out some fun things for you, and I don't want them all to be super fancy. So drain rock, like this is 3/8 inch drain rock. It's about $40 a yard. So this is a lovely way to create pathways in your garden. This is our co-founder Ellie Inslee's garden. And so there's a before on the left and the after on the right. It's a different perspective, but you can see what you can get out of like just a grassy little space. And then you can create this like amazing garden. We use steel edging and flagstone throughout the garden. Her 0 to 5 is very much fortified. And then we also created downspout like swales from the downspouts to bring the water into the landscape with 100% native plants. So this was a real success and really beautifully separated. So these islands are separated by the flagstone and boulders, and it's a very safe garden. Another smaller space. This was another one in Grayton, where they had a lawn and a big privet shrub or something. We took all that out and created a little patio in the front space and this wonderful habitat garden. And they sit in this space and just enjoy the butterflies and especially the hummingbirds and joining them in this garden. So it doesn't have to be a gigantic change for you. It can be a really sweet, small change as well. So thinking about the design in the 30 to 100 space. So this is just an opportunity, really your 0 to 30 is the most important space in your garden, as we've encouraged you throughout the last 2 talks. But the 30 to 100 is just you have the opportunity here to have larger groups of shrubs and trees. You can think about landing pads for pollinators, and you can think of using more shrubs in larger groupings, separated even by arbor mulch or rock pathways and such. But in this zone, 30 to 100, you can use arbor mulch to separate those islands, which can be larger. So you can think. So we encourage you to think out from your house. And this is a great image. So out from the home, you can see that they've shored up their trees, and then there's plant material in that 30 to 5 to 30, and then 30 to 100 they have larger grouping of plants, maybe more covered for birds. The quail need, like here they really wanted to encourage quail to come back after the fires because this landscape was burned but the home wasn't, so they're encouraging more cover. So you can just think out from your home, but also I like to think of like from the wildlands to your home, like how is the fire going to come into your landscape, and how you can manage your landscape coming up to the home. But I think this is especially a good image of trees around the home being shored up, but still being like overhanging the home. It's fine to have your trees. So I wanted to talk a little bit about trees. I was just thinking about Petaluma and South County or wherever you all are, maybe West County. California buckeye is a wonderful plant to add to your landscape. It's kind of a multi-trunk pollinator powerhouse, beautiful tree. Coast live oak is one of our top habitat plants. This is a shot up from Jenner Headlands, but it tolerates the wind, which I know that Petaluma has issues with. I lived there for a couple years, and so West Petaluma gets a lot of wind. So Coast live oak is a plant that really can tolerate wind and be a great street tree or great garden tree. Toyon is a super pollinator shrub, great for screening, and can take, like during the fires, a lot of them got burned and they came back really resiliently and fluffy and and more, I don't know, we don't like to say fire wise. I don't even know what the right term is, but you can shear them, you can cut them down to the ground and they come back much more, more resilient. California currant, another beautiful blooming, winter blooming, January blooming shrub that just adds so much delight to your garden. And coffeeberry, I have to say, it's one of my favorites. I put them in every garden. This is Mount San Bruno. I would suggest, you know, if you want a taller coffeeberry, there's just a straight Frangula californica, Rhamnus, if you guys are old like me. But the Mount San Bruno stays tidier. So like, think about like when you look into your plants, you need to understand that like cultivars and selections are different. So make sure you read up on your plants, because the ones you buy might be low growing, they might be bigger. There's a lot of options there. Thinking about what to use between the islands of plants out in this 30 to 100, there's so much opportunity. So you can use arbor mulch or compost. I suggest you hydrate on like late season days. You can use gravel, crushed rock, pebble. This is a picture of Festuca rubra, but Carex panza is also another great option for in between islands of plants in the Petaluma region, or Lipia, Phylla nodiflora, which is a lovely ground cover that can be sheared. It can take water, it can take no water. It seems to stay lower with no water, but it supports a lot of butterflies, especially the common buckeye butterfly. But just think about this one as it's a great pollinator plant. So you'll get bees, a lot of bees. So if you have kids running around in there, you might want to think about that. So water. So resilient is biodiverse, fire wise, and water saving. And water saving is one of the key pieces in why we use native plants, because they don't require as much water as non-native plants. They're adapted to our local water regime, summer dry climates, but also they need water. They're especially in the first couple of years of them going in. So here's a grid system at one of our demonstration gardens. And I encourage you, if you want to learn more, to visit our website at the Habitat Corridor Project, but also livinglearninglandscapes.com. We have 8 amazing gardens that we've designed with the master gardeners, including irrigation plans and all of the calculations. So you can do your buyback program just by they're all residential size landscapes, and you can pretty much like copy and paste into the buyback program from the city, especially the city of Santa Rosa and Petaluma, and they will qualify. So this is a drip grid system. So if you have good drainage and when you're installing young plants, this is it's a okay way to deal with irrigation. Irrigation is tricky. Sometimes we use these lower water use MP rotator systems that hydrate the whole garden, but they're tricky because you have to have the risers high for shrubs and things like that. Or if you have a small garden, you can hand water or use a low sprinkler and move it around your garden once a month, once a week. Like John has some great calculations that he didn't share yet. But I think like you just want to dig down in the soil and see how far the water goes and make sure the roots are getting plenty of water and the soil is hydrated. But it's tougher when it's a young garden. This is easier when it's a more advanced garden. But reach out to us if you want to learn more about this. So a habitat garden really needs food, cover, and water. So you need you're encouraging these wonderful, birds, butterflies, pollinators, but we cannot think about no water. So we with the low water revolution, they're not watering lawns has created this real problem for pollinators. So you really need to think about water in your garden. So like I even use boulders with some shallow spaces in them that maybe even you put a drip emitter up on the boulder, which, you know, just to get the boulder a little wet, and then the bees really love that. Or you can use a small habitat fountain that's a recirculating. This lower picture is a recirculating little small fountain just with one little small boulder, but it really provides water for habitat. So we've talked about some things along, but I just wanted to give you all some tips for successful habitat planting. You want to have many types of flowers, like long tubular and aster type, and large groupings, which we call pollinator targets. So like you like this one plant, like get 5 of them and make sure they're flowering at different times. And then think of plants that provide both nectar and pollen sources. This one, Eriophyllum lanatum, woolly blue curl, is a wonderful aster that just blooms all the time. So you'll really enjoy this one. So definitely check out those. I'll let you know, I'll show you guys the websites again at the end, but we have a lot of resources for you to reach out to get all these plants and do this for yourselves. And my last message with natives is I find that people are so anxious to see their garden flourish, but natives put their resources into their roots first. So they take the first 2 years really encouraging their roots down so that they can survive a drought. So you'll be so encouraged if you just give them time and don't give up on them for the first couple of years. Give them deep watering once a week in the summer for the first couple of years, once a month when they get older. This was a lovely red bud in my front garden that I had for 4 years, and I was like, I guess it's not going to do anything. And then this year it bloomed and it was flourishing. So another tip is don't move them. They don't like it. Natives don't like it because they're sending all this energy into their roots. So figure out the right place for your plant and don't move it, because most of them will die. So that's like a tip that I've had to learn the hard way. So just wrapping up, I wanted to give you all, and you'll get these slides, but I came up with this wonderful combination for Petaluma region, like mostly 101 west, but this could actually work like east a little bit. But these are some plants that I encourage you, if you wanted to do like a 10 by 10 little native garden, you could take out 100 square feet of your lawn and you could plant these plants, and it will be your own little mini habitat garden. So I encourage you to do that. So as the last representative of our Resilient Landscape Coalition, here's a lot of our websites. I know we've shown them a lot and that you will get them again, but now we will encourage all kinds of questions and be open to your garden issues. Thank you for listening.
All right. Thank you, April. And thank you, everyone, for sticking through this wonderful workshop. And now it is time for questions. So we have a great panel today. Ready for questions. So if you haven't gotten them into the Q&A box, now is your chance. But to start off, we have a couple questions about mulch or wood chips. So first, someone's asking if we use wood chips with our native plants.
April and John, do you want to take a first stab?
I'll go first. I can give.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, it's just going to give you a chance to catch your breath.
No, it's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, I use wood chips extensively under native plants. I don't live in a super high fire risk area. I'm in the city of Napa. Not that Napa doesn't have its issues, but where I am is reasonably safe. So I use wood chips from tree companies that they will dump for free. I am cognizant about plants too close to the, to the home and so forth. But I really feel like wood chips have a great role where they are appropriate to conserve moisture, to reduce weed growth, to keep the soil cool and shaded, provide some amount of contribution to organic matter for soil life and health.
John, how do you feel about composted versus just wood chips from the arborist?
Yeah, and I know there's a question here, so we might as well go into that too. So I think there's a lot of confusion around that because the suppliers are not necessarily, there isn't a thing that is composted wood chips. To some people, that would mean turning it every 2 weeks and moistening it to the right level of moisture and so forth. I think many suppliers, it's a pile of wood chips that sits for several months. And in that sense, it is composted, which is something, which is significant in that it helps to break down the leafy material. So you're ending up with, less dry leaves mixed in and more of a consistent wood chip material. My takeaway on organic mulch, again, where it's appropriate, would be avoid the things that are really, really small. Gorilla hair is the very worst because it is just, it's tinder basically. But also I would steer clear of the other very small chunks and pieces, the little mini pine bark nuggets and that sort of product. And go for something that is sort of medium. Obviously you don't want big chunks of wood as well. So, so something middle of the road is probably most appropriate. Composted if possible, or having sat around enough that a lot of the leafy material is decomposed would be best.
I like that, having sat around long enough. That's perfect.
So if I could weigh in on that. So when I reference composted wood mulch, it's because that is directly what was one of the 8 treatments that was studied in that University of Nevada at Reno and University of California study. And they had sourced it from a landscape supply company that had done a form of some type of composting process on those wood chips. So that's why I specifically cite that, because it's coming directly from that study. Most of us are using wood chips, that maybe we've gotten for free from a tree service company that's dropped them on their property. I will say the picture that was on my slide is composted. It's not like a formal composting process, but it's a pile of wood chips from tree clearing work up in my 30 to 100 foot zone up the slope that had sat there for about a year. And if you dig down into it, it's really rich and yummy. And we've been using that, judiciously around the property. So I'm personally really excited, as I mentioned, about this new mulch study that I understand is going on, and seeing what additional research and scientific support we have for flammability of different materials that we use for composting. So hope that helped. But I also will say compost makes a really great mulch as well. So that's another option to consider.
It's definitely more about
considered too rich for native.
No, I think compost is great, but I think we have confusion around like what is compost and what is compost with a little bit of mulch in it. I'm confused about that because we use a product from Grab and Grow that's has a lot of wood mulch in it. Whereas I think of compost as like from your garden, like all your stuff. Jennifer is like a pro on that. Maybe she has a thought.
She's a master composter.
Yeah, so compost that's finished and has no pieces to it that you can still recognize as a branch or a chunk of wood. And finished compost will smell rich and like soil, and it will look like soil. And so it actually has a high water holding capacity as well. So it's a really great thing to be incorporating around plants that require it or can tolerate it well, because it's holding more water within the landscape.
Let me also speak to that, because Marilyn Sarney also comes up with a question. I'm curious as to why you would exclude well-rotted compost, which is kind of what was more what you're describing, Jennifer, not composted wood chips, she said, from zone 0 and 1. And, I want to say a couple things about compost. One is that and I'll get back to this one in a second. What Mimi said is that you don't want large areas of composted wood chips, because all of them, including Gorilla Hair, but all of them will actually smoke or burn, kind of like a cigar, if you think about it. That just pretty much every type of wood chip, except for the big chunks, the 2-inch chunks, those will actually probably burn with the flame. But the thing is, and I'm also bringing in the question of, do you put gravel underneath some plants, and can you use composted, not composted, but pebbles under plants? So if you think about it, if you have some plants that, maybe like the manzanita that April brought up, you can actually put some pebble compost under those plants to break up your wood chips or your mulch. And then you can also put some stepping stones through. So you can have like a planting island that's somewhat larger, broken up by pebble mulch under certain types of plants and stepping stones, so that you can get into the plant. So you can think about your islands as being larger or smaller, depending on how you're breaking up the mulch underneath and what other plants are inside them. And then back to the question about the compost in the 0 to 5, it is true that Steve Quarles has said that fully composted compost that doesn't have any wood type material is non-flammable, that it's possibly true, but you can't absolutely be sure that that's what you've got. And so we're recommending not using it, because it's people don't necessarily fully understand, as you've shown, as you see, we have shown exactly what compost is. And so it can be confusing. So just to be on the safe side, and it's might come down with insurance companies as well as different regulations, that you have to have something completely non-flammable, i.e. gravel and so on. So you can see there's no really strict rules yet until we actually come through with this new legislation that should be arriving in the beginning of next year.
And Ellie, I'd love to give our fire official an opportunity. Jessica, if you have anything you want to weigh in around mulch and wood mulch and that topic.
Yeah, so thank you. There's first of all, as an amateur avid gardener, I would say that for people that are thinking about doing compost in their own yard around here, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the clarification is that we actually don't have compost bins around here. We have worm bins, because it's not hot enough to compost unless you're actually actively going. I have a bin, but it doesn't actually compost. It's more of a worm bin. There's so many worms in it. Because somebody want to talk about that?
Jen's an expert on that.
Where I grew up, there it actually did decompose in the sun and the heat and the moisture versus, right. It's so cool here at night. It cools down enough.
So yeah, the simple answer I like to say is compost happens. And
right, but it's
yes, there are
worms, right?
So there are two main ways of doing it. You can do it in a hot pile, or you can do it in a cool pile with worms involved. And so I'm actually giving a full 2-hour workshop on Saturday, July 30th in Guerneville at the library from 10:30 to 12:30. It's free. And I go into great detail about setting up that hot pile, which is, yes, what we ultimately want for that backyard style composting, because we want to kill any pathogens, weed seed, all the not so great stuff. And we want the good, rich material. And then worm composting is done in a separate bin. You would purchase worms or get worms from a friend for that. And that's a different style with cooler temperatures. But if you can make it to that, I go into great detail.
Learn a lot more detail about that. I will say that there's a lot of types of mulch options. I'm actually experimenting with plant cover as a mulch for the ground on a slope where mulch isn't going to hold or stick, and I really don't want it given proximity to the house. So there are a lot of different ways to look at providing cover for the soil. whether it's wood mulch or compost or gravel that we talked about, or even experimenting with plant cover of ground covers on a slope as a possible form of protecting the soil from evaporating and losing moisture.
Yeah. So, and sorry for the little bit of diversion, but I sort of wanted to clarify a little bit of that. Also, so when we're talking about wildfire, we're kind of talking about a couple different scenarios. We're also sort of including in all of these things that we're talking about in relation to wildfire are structure fires or residential commercial fires on a hot day where we might have a little bit of wind or other weather behavior and patterns that cause a risk to other adjacent structures. I see in one of the questions about the, only having a side yard of like 5 to 8 feet, right? So in the sort of smaller scale in the structure fire where there might be risk, doing the things for vegetation management and preparedness will help you, if it's not your house or your neighbor's house or vice versa, whatever the scenario is, that protection from the radiant heat and other avenues for fire spread that we've talked about. So we're not just talking about wildfire in a sense, we're talking about the sort of the other types of fire as well. When it comes to wildfire, we have sort of expanded past what we used to see, I would say closer to the start of my career 20 years ago or 20 plus years ago, where it's the urban wildfire out in the interface past the city limits most of the time, where a lot of the pictures we saw today. And the weather patterns we're seeing today can spread those more quickly and more intensely, but we're also seeing those sorts of fires in city limits more frequently, as we saw sort of really starting in 2017 on a more publicized scale. I would say that's not something that was completely abnormal. It just wasn't necessarily in the public face prior to 2017. So in the Tubbs fire, the campfire sort of scenarios, we're seeing a variety of survival rates among structures that vary in what is survivable. But the biggest thing that we're seeing is the combination of building construction on our exterior of our homes and the preparedness in our landscapes. So we really have to think about both of those things. But when we're talking about a fire of that scale, we also have to realize that we could have done everything possible and it's not going to be survivable. And so that's the current unfortunate situation. But we're hoping then that getting all of the preparedness done all over the state and all of our communities, that those things start to diminish and we see survivability when you have done that preparedness in your neighborhood, not just your own home. So in my opinion, what I have seen from the science is that 0 to 5 foot zone is crucial for having non-combustible materials. So rock, pavers, other non-combustible materials. Once you get past that, having the islands of vegetation and combustible materials is really what, as the fire service, we look for providing your house the survivability in terms of what we can do after the fire has started. Because when there are islands and as a fire front is moving through, so for example, fire front is moving through and we're out doing our structure protection, we see a home that has islands of vegetation and an umberlands in a small island of brush. We have enough capacity in our firefighting abilities and resources, such as the water in our tanks and our wildland engines, to put that out, check the rest of the home, do what we can, and as the fire front passes, we pass and move on to the next bits of homes. When there is not islands of vegetation and defensible space, it makes our job nearly impossible to provide that after the fire protection and do anything. And oftentimes I would say what we're seeing is that by the time the fire front gets there, if that defensible space has not been done, and there's not some sort of effort towards building construction, even with any efforts that we put out, we're at a loss to provide much protection. And also, as sort of a side note, because of the intensity that we're seeing in some of these fires, it sort of used to be that, it was a balance of providing protection and making sure that we can still get out. And now we're sort of like, can we still get out? And then, okay, yes, we could do something, because of the intensity and the entrapment and danger to our lives that really doesn't do the public any good either, because then if we're trapped, the rest of the crews are focused on getting us out as well, so that we can do more good. So I hope that wasn't too much of a tangent on answering that question, but
Great
I
tangent.
think the legislation for the 0 to 5 foot zone is really long overdue. And we're seeing the science behind it now, which I think is what is able to push the legislation so quickly.
All right. So we have a question about slope. Some good resources for practical actions for slope. So the suggestions are including mulch considerations, plants to minimize erosion, and perhaps separately for slopes 10 to 20%, and then perhaps needed for steeper slopes 20% and larger.
So I'll just say personally, because I live on a slope and have a pretty steep slope directly below me, my house, in my 5 to 30. I'm starting to play with perennial ground covers where there's mulch won't stick. I've tried it. It didn't stick because of the slope, degree of the slope. So I'm playing with, to keep my flammability low, non-woody perennial ground covers that provide cover for the soil and help hold the soil on the slope, which is also an issue for me. I don't know if April and John and Jen and Ellie have other experience or recommendations they might have from managing slopes.
I'll say really quickly that you could also terrace. I know that you with some small rock walls, which can also help with fire moving uphill.
Mm-hmm.
But I know you if you don't own your property, you may not be able to do that.
I would remind the writer to think of, recognize that native plants are really unique in having oftentimes a very extensive root system. And so if you look at the root system, for example, of a perennial native bunch grass like purple needlegrass, it's unbelievable. The extent of the root, and grass roots are not like tree roots in that they're very fibrous, they're very fine, and really can hang on to things well. So I would think you don't really describe your fire risk situation, but I might think of purple needlegrass as a favorite of mine. California fescue might be appropriate, especially with a little bit more shade. And then also think there are, ground covers are great, and that might be kind of the first thing you think of, but there's probably some opportunity for at least a few shrubs. One in particular that often gets named as good for slope stability is, I just lost it. Pacific ninebark. This is a shrub similar to some of the spireas and things, but a native shrub from around Sonoma County that is cited for being particularly good for erosion control.
So we have another question about the neighbor relations kind of thing that comes about with one neighbor has his house surrounded by bamboo. So how to help encourage neighbors, or are there mandates that are coming down the pipe that we can, count on for better safety?
Well, I will say, so the state of California is coming out with legislation to mandate the 0 to 5 foot zone. As I understand, it's for very high fire and maybe high fire severity zones. Maybe Jessica can clarify if I'm not correct on that. In the SRA, I think there's one specific LRA.
The very high fire in LRA is going to be part of the mandate. Yep.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So if you're in a very high fire severity zone in the SRA or the LRA, then there will be legal requirements, for the 0 to 5 foot zone. Joining a COPE group, there's so many amazing COPE groups springing up around Sonoma County and trying to, so you're not creating neighbor on neighbor difficulty, which can be really hard. But, creating a group community dynamic around wildfire preparedness and helping each other be better prepared. I don't know if Jessica or anybody else would weigh in on more on how to bring your neighbor to to the table on that topic.
I think there's a couple different options. One, if you're in Petaluma, we're now a cool city, and so there's some neighborhood groups popping up around that can help you, get in touch and have a community approach to it. So it isn't, a neighbor on neighbor. I think probably everyone in their life somehow or another has had a challenging neighbor or issue, and that could be helpful. The other thing is a group really is firewise communities. And if your neighborhood is not currently a firewise community, it's pretty easy to get one started. The state and local agencies are working really hard to get those started. It comes with some requirements for number of people involved and how much work is being done. But all of those requirements on an annual basis, all those requirements are really pretty easy to meet. It's not like a 40-hour a month commitment or something. I believe it's about 20 hours a year. Either you pay for somebody to do it or you can do it yourself and document that. There are some benefits that come to a firewise community outside of just the neighborly interaction and getting more vegetation management and emergency preparedness done, such as insurance discounts. They recognize that there is that requirement for maintenance and being fire wise, and so that is one of the benefits. It's pretty easy to find out about. If you just type in firewise to any internet browser, you can find out more about it. If you've got one in your neighborhood, you can contact your local fire department as well to see if you have one. Those are two really great options. Also just calling the local city or fire department to see if they have any requirements. I know, for example, in Marin, where I used to work, there was it was not allowed to plant any more additional bamboo. And now with the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority, there's grants to remove. So there's different options out there. It's about figuring out what those are for your specific area.
All right. Well, we are just about at time. If there's any panelists who's an outstanding question they want to just quickly answer.
I feel bad because I just missed one that I didn't mean to, but somebody asked what the heat around Pebble was, and I was wondering, I don't know exactly what they mean, but I was wondering if they meant like when we were adding this rock mulch, like what kind of heat is generated around the plants. And that's a concern that I have. And Ellie, I don't know if you have thoughts on this too, but it depends on the plant community, like if it's a chaparral plant, I think it would be fine with that heat as a rock mulch, but rock mulch is a touchy kind of thing to use in the landscape.
Yeah, there are some plants that I know you asked about scientific studies, and I have not seen a scientific study.
I haven't either.
Yeah.
But we do, from what I've heard, it is more recommended to use the rock mulch under plants that can actually handle warmer soils, because my experience, an unscientific study is that the rocks themselves can transmit the heat deeper through the mulch. But another thing to think about, though, how you see mulch piled up against plants in some places, that's actually a really bad idea for many, many reasons. But if you imagine a fire in a landscape, you're going to actually girdle the tree if that mulch actually does catch fire and smolder. So you want to keep mulch away from your tree roots.
Well, and I think the question really was like, if you're having larger expanses of concrete or, this hardscape, does that contribute to, higher levels of heat generated in the landscape? And, I have seen some informal reports from UC advisors, measuring, a blacktop temperature versus, a planted bed. And yeah, it's hotter and it's going to generate more heat. So everything we're talking about is about a balance. And looking at balancing sustainable landscape principles with, you know, the benefits of those with Firewise, being Firewise for, you know, moving ahead in our future. And we all have to look at how we balance all those, you know, competing requirements to make ourselves better prepared.
I don't think that we talked enough. There wasn't enough time to talk about plant community, but it's really important that folks like look into the plants and the plant communities and what they're using in their landscape. Like Ellie said, like some plants like that heat and some plants are not going to want that heat around them.
Yeah, I'll just say one more thing though. If you having trees overhead, creating shade can help to balance any mulch that's rocky that you create. So, you know, and the Steve Quarles, who was also quoted early on, will say you don't have to cut the trees branches over your roof. Now it'd be interesting. I know we've gone over time, but that Marin and some insurance companies are more aggressive about that, and they will tell you to cut the branches off of your house, but the trees do actually create shade, and there, at least in Sonoma County, the ordinance does not say anything about removing the tree branches over your house.
Yes, but then you also need to consider your appetite for maintenance, because it's also
right, you have to work
better. And if it's in your 0 to 5, then you need to be on it and your gutters and maintaining it, and you know, being a little more vigilant within the 5 to 30 as well.
I see a sort of comment here about insurance companies and just another quick thing about it. And then also talking about the developments being less than 20 feet apart and such. I'll give a little bit of my perspective and kind of where I see things going. I think that and this is, you know, a little bit of personal and professional sort of thoughts here behind things, but I think that we're going to see a drastic change in the way insurance, prevention, and response are all combined together, working together, and manifesting in the next 5 to 10 years. There are insurance companies that are taking the hard line, we won't even insure anybody, and are dropping without any option to renew at all in the urban interface, whether it's high fire, you know, very high fire or whatever. And, you know, they may continue to thrive in metropolitan areas and be just fine without those areas. Then there are brand new insurance companies that are deciding to start up and operate outside of the California Insurance Commission on a wildland urban interface, high fire, you know, hazard severity zone model. It is a completely different model. And I won't be surprised at all. I won't put my life savings on it, but I won't be surprised at all if in 5 to 10 years they are thriving and doing good things for our communities out in those areas. The focus that the last 5 years have had on California, our changing climate, whether it's, you know, the actual climate or our wildfire climate, is causing significant change at the state level, and filtering down and in conjunction with the local level to talk about how we respond, how we prepare, how we engage with our communities better, more frequently, and do more work. Marin is an example of a county that is being quite aggressive in having a tax to provide funding to residents to reach out for it, and inspections throughout the county in regards to wildfire prevention. So I say all that, and that I think anyone here is obviously interested in all of this, and I hope that brings you a little bit of hope if you're feeling defeated about any sort of part of this topic. Groups like this that are bringing together the habitat and, you know, the native landscape part of, and bringing a completely holistic view to making sure that we can enjoy our lives in our communities, in our homes, and not moonscape and not be worried about wildfire is exactly what's needed. And it's invigorating to me to see that this is happening all over, including our lovely county.
Right on. I can't think of a better close. And I don't know that we've ever not gotten to all the questions, but it was a super active group. Some really great questions. Hopefully we we were able to address enough of what you guys.
And don't forget to reach out to your local fire department if you have questions. We are all here. We're obviously in the middle of fire season, so we're crazy busy, but I promise that everyone out there tries to get back to everything, whether it's today, tomorrow, or next week.
As well as all of us. And you will get a follow-on email from us with the link, with the recording of the workshop, with resources, with the PowerPoint, and our contact information. And if you have further questions for us, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Buddy.
Have a good night.
Okay, thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.